Hello everyone. I wanted to show you this endgame that my coach showed me. It was really something else. It's an endgame between Namig Guliyev with the white pieces and Velislav Kukov with the black pieces. Kukov is an international master and Guliyev is a grandmaster. This endgame was very impressive from White's perspective. Starting in this position, we see that White enjoys the bishop pair compared to Black's bishop and knight. It's one thing to know that the bishop pair is stronger than the bishop and knight, but another thing entirely to prove it. And this game is a very excellent demonstration of the power of the two bishops, especially in an endgame where pawns are on both sides of the board. It also illustrates a handful of other very useful endgame concepts. And starting from this position, we can think of what kind of plan we want to do before we even start looking at individual moves. One very common idea when you have a bishop pair and your opponent does not, is to look at the bishop that your opponent does not have a partner for. In this case, the light square bishop. Both sides have a dark square bishop, but only white has the light square bishop. Trying to extrapolate further, we can try to imagine positions, for example, where black's pawns are stuck on light squares, while white's pawns are on dark squares. This would benefit white, as white would easily be able to defend the dark squares with his dark square bishop against the dark square assailant from black, whereas black is going to have a harder time defending all of his light squares against your light square bishop, especially with a single knight, especially if the bishop has scope on both sides of the board. This is a very natural plan to come up with, but it's interesting to see how Guliyev begins to try to put it into action. First of all, there is a tactical motif here, which many of you may have already spotted. This fork is actually quite strong if it were playable. In this position, of course, it's not, because bishop takes c5 simply wins the pawn. But it makes the first move for white quite obvious, bishop e3, creating a threat of c5 and giving the bishop a good square. Do note that bishop h6 here, trying to limit the king's movement, doesn't quite work. Simply f5, and the king can easily start becoming active. Not to mention bishop f8, getting out of the nasty c5 and offering a trade of bishops, which is not something white is interested in at this time. After bishop e3, we also notice that black's knight is kind of limited for squares, not just because white's pawns are strong, but also because this pawn on a7 is actually hanging. In effect, black's knight is somewhat pinned to this pawn, except for the move knight c8, which black decides to play. It's possible for white to begin playing c5, but in fact, black isn't really threatening on doing that. If black played c5 in this position, his b7 pawn is actually hanging. And if black decides to try to get rid of this weakness by simply playing b6 and c5, this also doesn't work, because now the c6 pawn is actually hanging. So in this position, we begin to realize that white's bishops are actually very strong, and they're putting a lot of pressure on black's position. This knight is a little awkward and difficult to move. These pawns are a little bit awkward and difficult to move. So white's in no real hurry to play c5, even though it does contribute to the plan of actually fixing this pawn chain on light squares. Black simply isn't threatening to play c5 yet. Both sides begin to centralize their king, which, as any endgame player knows, is a very important part of an endgame. An active king oftentimes can win endgames. In this position, however, white decides to play c5 with a very important plan. Now, at first glance, it appears that white has blocked his own dark square bishop from attacking this pawn on a7. But Guliyev is a very strong grandmaster, and this move is not without a plan. When I first saw this position, I thought that perhaps white could try to march his king over to the king's side to try to attack this pawn on h7, which is difficult to defend. But in truth, this is not the best idea. For example, king e4, f5, and perhaps he can play king f3 with the idea of playing bishop f4. However, in this position, simply king c4 is very good. If white decides to try to trade the dark square bishops, black doesn't particularly mind this. And the resulting endgame might actually benefit black. So this doesn't constitute any serious danger for black or any real plan for white. Instead, Guliyev has a different idea. His idea is to play b4. The idea behind b4 is to play b5. This would create a permanent weakness on the queen side. For example, if black did nothing, white would play b5, and this instantly starts to create problems. If c takes b5, bishop takes b7. This knight becomes difficult to defend. After king d7, for example, c6 check, and white has a very dangerous passed pawn. Not to mention, the pawn on b5 is quite difficult to defend. So white introduces this threat into the position. Black plays a6 in order to stop b5. White plays a4, insisting on his plan. Nothing has changed. White wants to create a weakness on the queen side. Black then brings his knight to e7, shoring up the c6 square and perhaps thinking of bringing his knight to d5 or f5 in the future. After all, white enjoys active pieces. Black should try to do the same. White plays king c4 with the idea of playing b5. Note that knight d5 here doesn't work. White simply trades the knight for the bishop, retreats his king, and just 3 versus 2 is going to help white create a passed pawn, while this pawn is blockaded. So instead, black tries f6. Black's plan is to play g5 to limit the scope of white's bishop and perhaps prevent h4 in the future. While white could play b5, white takes his time. He is in no rush to play b5 because it's an unstoppable threat. So white takes a few turns to improve his position, starting with h4. h4 is a very important move here. It puts the kibosh on g5. Black can no longer play this move without losing a pawn. It also gives this bishop another diagonal to work with. Black plays h5, trying to stop these pawns from moving further forward. Perhaps moves like g4 and h5 were on the cards. White can still play b5, but more improvements can still be made. White plays bishop d2. This is a very subtle move. It avoids running into knight d5 and knight f5 with tempo in the future. So if black decides to play either of those moves, white will not have to react. Black tries bishop e5. His plan is to try to activate this bishop, perhaps in a situation where white plays b5 and trades occur, that this bishop can maybe find a home on d4, attacking this pawn, where white has to defend either passively or decide to trade bishops in this endgame, which is unfortunately completely drawn due to this move knight d5, which hits this pawn, blockades this diagonal, and stops the king from moving forward. If the bishop decides to trade in order to move the king forward, this is inconsequential. King keeps an eye on the c5 pawn. If white ever decides to capture on b7, black simply trades on c5 in this completely drawn king and pawn endgame. After bishop e5, trying to make his pieces more active, white plays bishop h3, trying to achieve the opposite for black. This gives black an unappetizing choice. Either he retreats his king to a more passive square, pins his own knight, or plays f5, which creates a permanent weakness on g6. Black opted to do this, as it is the least passive of all of his options. After f5, white simply returns his bishop back to g2, and argues that this structure is easier to attack. At this point, black doesn't really have much of a plan. He tries bishop c7, and asks white to prove his advantage. Black's plan is simply just to shuffle back and forth, and see if white can actually create a win here. Unfortunately, on the losing side of these positions, you don't really have a lot of active options. After having played h4, bishop d2, bishop h3, white finally decides to play b5, having made all the improvements he deems necessary. Trades ensue, And here it'd be foolish for black to simply recapture on b5, as it would create a very easy target on b7 that is quite difficult to defend. The difference in this position, why knight d5 doesn't work, is because white has king c4. This knight will be captured unless it's moved, and once it moves, the b7 pawn will fall. This passed pawn will win the game for white. So instead of recapturing, black plays bishop back to e5. It's not very clear how white's intending on winning this. Guliyev tries bishop g5. The idea is simple. He's going to take the knight, and then once the knight who is defending this pawn is no longer there, he will capture twice on c6. This appears to be a difficult threat to meet, but Kukov isn't dismayed. He simply plays bishop c7. Kukov actually makes a very important argument here. If white decides to win the pawn by playing bishop takes e7, king takes e7, pawn takes c6, pawn takes c6, and bishop takes c6, white has just entered into an opposite-colored bishop endgame, which is actually very difficult for him to win, especially considering that black has the move f4. This move forces white to capture. If he doesn't, black will simply take on f4. The pawns are even. This pawn is difficult to defend, and perhaps it is black now who is making some progress. After g takes f4, bishop takes f4, black has a very simple plan. Black is going to play g5 and continue to trade all of these pawns away. If black can successfully trade all of these pawns, the single pawn will not be enough to win the game for white, as black will simply sacrifice the bishop for the pawn, and white will be left with a simple king and bishop versus king, which is not enough material to mate. This position is actually quite critical, and can be quite difficult to find the solution for white's problems. I urge you to take a minute and examine this position, and try to come up with a decent plan for white. One thing that might become apparent is that these pawns are actually quite strong and could pose a serious threat of queening, especially if the bishop were to sacrifice itself on c6 at some point, perhaps after a trade on e7. Unfortunately, in this position, it's simply not enough. This bishop and king are going to be easily able to defend. This king can go to c8 or can follow the enemy king wherever it goes. White cannot create a passed pawn in this position, and as a result will not be able to win. But these threats can still manifest themselves in other ways, and the solution here is actually quite beautiful. It revolves around the fact that this bishop actually has very few squares for it to go. White begins with b6. b6 limits the amount of squares this bishop can go to, and if it wishes to stop this bishop takes c6 idea, followed by b7, it must keep an eye on b8. For example, after the move bishop e5, which was played in the game, f4, the bishop actually doesn't have the luxury of retreating to this diagonal. If it does so, the simple tactic of taking on e7, followed by taking on c6, creates an unstoppable passed pawn. This bishop cannot return to e5 as the square is protected. If black's bishop retreats to b8, white will simply bring his king forward, and black's pieces are helpless. Instead of this, black tries to trade off the dark square bishops in order to give himself a chance to survive. White accepts the bishop trade and places his king on d4. His long-term plan is actually very clever. White wants to put this bishop on c4. The threat is to actually activate this bishop in such a way to attack these weaknesses that were created earlier, these pawns that are stuck on light squares, which black's going to have a difficult time defending. For example, imagine that white's bishop is on c4. If white is able to achieve bishop c4 in a position like this, it becomes blatantly clear what his plan is. Black's king is now relegated to surveying these two squares. It must stay on f6 and e7. The reason for this is that black's king must continue at all times to surveil these two squares, which are entry points for the white bishop. If the king gives up control of the e6 square, white can bring his bishop in. And even after knight e7, white's king begins to march forward. Now the threat is clear. White's going to move in and take the rest of these pawns. If black decides to relinquish the f7 square, bishop f7 simply wins. These pawns are too weak and impossible to defend. Guliyev saw this in this moment and decided to trade the dark square bishops. Kukov attempts to put up some resistance. But after bishop c4, it becomes blatantly obvious what's going to happen. As we've discussed earlier, white would like to bring his bishop to f7 in order to capture the g6 pawn, or to e6 in order to capture the b7 pawn. It's difficult for black to stop both of these threats. Black tries knight c8, and everything here is winning, including bishop f7. The idea is, after knight e7, king e5. We transpose to this position anyway. Guliyev chooses to play king e5 first, marching his king in unstoppably towards f6. Knight e7, bishop e6, and this is a simply winning endgame. Black tries knight d5, but after bishop d5, cd5, and c6, Kukov decided that he had enough and resigned in this position, as queening is unstoppable. For example, after b takes c6, b7, and the king cannot move forward to stop the queen. After king c8, simply king takes d5, and these pawns are just too strong. If b takes c6, king takes c6. If king moves away, this pawn will queen, and if the king moves to b8, white still pushes the pawn and plays king c7. Now the queen is unstoppable. I hope you enjoyed this endgame. I thought Guliyev's technique was quite masterful here, and really illustrated how strong the bishop pair can be. I may decide to make more videos like this if I find games that I find enjoyable enough. For now, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.